Hi, I'm Femi Okay, and you're in the stream. We're now live on Al Jazeera and YouTube.
And I'm Malika Bilal. With the 24-hour news cycle and perpetual bombardment of information, it can sometimes be difficult to dig deeper into a story.
On this episode of the stream, we will dive into 3 films now streaming on aljazeera.com that do just that. A Church of Trump, A Moral Debt, The Legacy of Slavery in the USA, and The Things We Keep.
First up, The Church of Trump, produced for Fault Lines. In this film, correspondent Josh Rushing and producer Anna Day go inside America's religious right to explore its grassroots strategies and the powerful institutions fueling its resurgence. Take a look.
In the United States, the religious right is on the march.
We were always hunting for the guy who would take our script and read it.
Their goal is to take control of one of the political parties, and they've effectively done that.
Fault Lines examines the Trump administration's special relationship with the religious right.
What did he get out of it?
The presidency.
And asks what evangelical support means for the future of the country. Church of Trump on Al Jazeera.
We're joined on our set by Fault Lines correspondent Josh Rushing and in New York, producer Anna Day. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hi. So good to have you here. I want to start on my laptop with 2 tweets, a tiny little history lesson from journalist Tom Crattenmaker. He writes, historically, evangelicals were the theological conservatives who smiled, engaged the culture, and were happy to share their faith. But now, and probably for a long time to come, evangelical communicates a political fact more than a religious identity. The fact that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. So Anna, I will give this one to you. There's a little change in history. When did that happen, and then why did it inspire you to make this doc?
Well, we have seen a politicization of the Christian right in America since the 80s with Reagan. We saw it through the 90s with the anti-abortion movement. But I think it was surprising after the 2016 election that so many evangelicals, 80% white evangelicals, turned out to vote for such an unscrupulous candidate. And I was one of those Americans that was a bit surprised by that. And I think many thought that perhaps these voters were conned by Trump. But what we found when we, began investigating this and looking at it further was that this is a movement that has had a very smart strategy for decades. There are people who are not reacting to politics that are happening around them. They have a vision for America, and they've been working very strategically at the grassroots and at the federal level to achieve this for years. And now they have administration that's very dependent on them, as they're the ones that brought this administration into office.
Josh, we learned so much about a certain branch of the evangelical church in the US just by your interactions with them, the way that they talk to you, who you talk to. There's a guy called Jeff Amex. I'm going to show a little clip of him. But before we do that, tell us about him. What do we need to know before we see the clip?
Jeff owns a hardware store in a rural part of Kentucky, Tennessee, just north of Knoxville. And he's fairly well known now for putting a sign on his door that says, "No gays allowed." And he says that he can legally do that because of the Supreme Court decision regarding the baker in Colorado. And so we went in, asked if he was around, and got a chance to talk to him and ask him some questions.
All right, here's a little bit of Josh asking Jeff Amex some questions. Check it out.
Just because a man in his past made mistakes doesn't mean he's unfit to run this country. This country right now is in better shape than it's ever been. In my lifetime, in your lifetime, and in his lifetime. It's better than it's ever been. There's no difference between a homosexual, a child molester, and a woman that's committed an abortion because she has killed her child. And I think all 3 of them deserve the same penalty.
What's that?
Abortion. They ought to be hung.
Why do you think Trump's a man of God?
He has been chosen by God to run this country. If anybody running is against homosexuality and against abortion, and for children's rights to live, yeah, I'm going to vote for them.
This tells us so much about what America is like right now.
Mm-hmm. Particularly outside the bubble where we are, D.C. or New York or L.A., in the middle of America. What you need to know is guys like that vote. They're politically active. Most Christians don't believe the same thing that he believes. Even most conservative Christians don't believe what the religious right believes. Even the New York Times today did a story about evangelicals and young evangelicals that are breaking away from the politics of their parents and the politics of Trump. The religious right, though, they are very organized, they have a strategy, and they vote. So for those who look at the midterms coming up as a kind of complacent, they don't know if they're going to go out or vote or not, this is how a very small minority has become politically extremely powerful, because they have a strategy. They have a plan. It begins in the voting booth. It runs through the judiciary. And what the whole plan is to reshape America into what they see as a Christian nation. And that just leaves a huge question for what does that mean for the rest of us who aren't Christian, who don't fit into their worldview. And it's not just a different worldview. They see a different world. They homeschool their kids. Their kids go from homeschool, they go to Christian universities. They watch Christian TV channels and listen to Christian radio stations. They never really have to intersect with the worldview that any of us would be familiar with. They see a completely different world. They're surrounded by completely different facts and information. And they have a political plan for this country. And they, by all means, are not complacent about this election coming up.
We're hearing from some of them online. This is Susan B. Anthony List, the organization that is an anti-abortion rights advocate group. They write in that under Trump, 2 justices were appointed to the Supreme Court who respect the constitutional right to life. They also then go on to say that there's been 29 circuit court judges and 53 district court judges confirmed thanks to President Trump. So, Anna, from the people that you talked to, was anyone able to reconcile the things that they saw as being pro-Christianity, pro-the Bible with the way that Trump has lived his life?
You know, some people did try to rationalize President Trump and apply, biblical stories about how God has used sinners in the past. But quite frankly, there were other people who were very realistic about the relationship, that it was a quid pro quo, and that this isn't really unprecedented in American politics. Many people on the left would be frustrated with President Clinton's sexual harassment, for example. But overall, his policies advanced their agenda, and people were willing to, support him. So it's not really unprecedented. It just seems jarring, given that these people call themselves values voters, and this man in office has had, countless family scandals and behavior that many wouldn't expect from somebody supported by these Christians.
They have a deal, though, and the deal wasn't implicit, it was explicit. When Trump was just a candidate, they flew like 1,000 of these pastors to New York, had a private meeting, and he said, give me your vote, give me your church's votes, and I'll give you what you want. What you want are judges, and I'll give them all to you. And a Christian writer covered it at the time and said that they shouldn't have taken the deal that Jesus already turned down. When Jesus goes into the desert, gets tempted for 40 days and 40 nights by the devil, one of the last temptations is the devil shows him all the cities in the world and says they can all be yours if you'll just kneel to me. All this political power can be yours. And Jesus said no. And that was the deal that these pastors took, according to like some in the Christian press who saw them take it. But it was an explicit deal that I need religious cover and I need your votes and I know what you want and I'm going to give it to you, the judges.
Anna, you started filming in June, July, and then you also were at the Kavanaugh hearing, and you saw a lot of women there, a lot of women who were really upset about the way the Kavanaugh hearing was going. And there's usually in every Fault Lines episode a moment which is incredibly emotional and painful and hard to deal with. Was that moment?
Yes, I'd say the most emotional part of this shoot for me was definitely being in the Senate Hart Building during the Kavanaugh hearings. They didn't just do a women's march, they did a survivors march where they lined up survivors 2 by 2, and they led this march of hundreds of people around the city while Kavanaugh was speaking to the senators inside. And it was one of the most powerful things I've ever experienced. I think everyone there felt that, from this pain that these people were sharing, that it would mobilize political power. But it became very clear that while these people were on the streets and being very brave, their power was not translating into the halls of Congress. And they do have a plan for the midterms. We'll see if they get out the same way the religious right does.
Malika.
I'll end with this tweet from Tom, who I read earlier. He says, given how things have gone in Washington and the historically high public disapproval ratings that have followed, this dynamic linking evangelicalism with the Trump administration has not been a good advertisement for Jesus.
So much to talk about, but for now, Anna Day and Josh Rushing, thank you so much for joining us from Fort Lyons. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
We move now to A Moral Debt, the legacy of slavery in the USA, produced for Al Jazeera correspondent. The film winds through the American South as journalist James Gannon explores what effect the oppression of enslaved people by his ancestors still has on Black lives in the U.S. today. Take a look.
A journey of personal discovery.
My great-grandfather, he was a slave of the Lee property.
Al Jazeera's James Gannon explores his family's legacy of slave ownership.
Like my family's, status and wealth has benefited from their choice to enslave people.
And America's debt to Black people today.
Some of us so scarred, we even scared to speak out, because it's a pride thing.
Al Jazeera correspondent, A Moral Debt.
Joining us from Doha, James Gannon, who's also a deputy news editor for Al Jazeera English. Welcome, James, to the stream. Now, for our audience that has not yet seen the film, spoiler alert, you are a descendant of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And so keeping that in mind, I want to bring up this tweet because there are a lot of revelations in this documentary. And Bahri here talks about one. He says, whatever happened to the promise of 40 horses, 40 acres of land, and freedom to the slaves? And in popular culture now, that is 40 acres and a mule. So that is the idea of reparations. And that's something that a lot of our audience seems to pick up on. And it's something that was picked up on in the film as well. So here is a comment from Stephen Thomas. He's an organizer and a lecturer who you actually featured in the film. And here's what he had to say.
Next year, 2019, marks the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans to the shores of Virginia. This documentary, A Moral Debt, serves to remind this nation's citizens that racial reconciliation is indeed possible, beginning first with the government, institutional, and private sector commitment to reparations to African Americans descended from those formerly enslaved.
Reparations, is that something you had thought much about before doing this documentary?
It really wasn't. I think it had probably crossed my mind before as something that seemed like a good idea, but might not ever be possible or really practical. And when I first started making this film, the focus was really just on statues. Like Robert E. Lee is my family member. Seeing what happened in Charlottesville with the Unite the Right rally, right-wing protests that erupted there around the planned removal of one of his statues, I initially wanted to take a look at that issue. The more I got into it, though, and looked at the legacy of enslavement that my family had left for me in this country, the more I realized that the root causes of the institutional racism and inequality that we see today really need a much bigger way to address it, and reparations was the one that I landed on.
James, what struck me was that what this film turned into was learning about Black people 101. There was so much that you didn't know and so much that you didn't understand. How is that possible as an American living in a multicultural, multiracial society, that there were some very basic things that you didn't know about Black people?
Yeah, I think that it's really just so easy to live in a bubble in America, if I'm honest, I lived in a pretty privileged life. My family wasn't rich, but we were comfortable, and growing up in mostly white communities, the inequality was something that I was never really faced with or came face to face with. And so although I had a general awareness of it, it was easy just kind of to go through life without having to come to terms with it. I'm just really grateful that I was able to learn more about the Black experience in America through this film, and share some of the really striking facts and figures about that through the project.
So many lessons learned. Let's just give our audience a little taster of one of those lessons. Have a look.
I actually met recently the descendants of one of the people my family enslaved, and found out that I'd actually known this woman, Estella, who's 90 years old now, most of my life.
What is her full name?
Her name is, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her last name, Estella.
Well, it's telling, that she's many years your senior, and yet you refer to her by her first name, right? There it is, right there.
I mean, I don't mean any disrespect. I have to check. Yeah.
Well, apparently no one else in your family has referred to her by any other name. Are we correct about that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I think it probably made both of us uncomfortable, for you to call me out there. Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Maybe not too much.
Yikes. James, you can redeem yourself right now. Miss Estella.
Miss Estella Belt, a name that I will never blank on again.
Oh my goodness. But I mean, this is what I was talking about, some really basic knowledge about how you address older black matriarchs in your community. You were really learning what it meant to be inside African American culture and where that fitted into American history. Malika.
There are organizations that are doing the work that I think many will hope that this documentary does as well. So this is just one of them, and Surge DC is the handle here. They are an organization that organizes white people for racial justice, and they say they canvass. It involves in-depth, one-on-one conversations that engage white people specifically on the need for reparations as a way to divest from white supremacy. They go on to say that they also try to emphasize in every event, reading group, every issue we discuss, whether policing, incarceration, segregation, it's all rooted in legacies of white supremacy and slavery. So with that in mind, what was the one thing that you think stood out to you as the most surprising?
I think the thing that stood out to me is how close the history of enslavement in America really is. We think of it as something that was a long time ago, but one of the things I learned through this film is that my grandmother's nanny was actually born enslaved in my family, and so that means that I knew somebody that was born into slavery. So that really brought it home as to how close it really is, and that legacy really is having a profound effect on the modern day.
It's interesting. We will have to leave it there for now. James Gannon, thank you so much for joining the stream. You can be sure to catch his film, A Moral Debt, now streaming on AlJazeera.com.
So our final film comes from the documentary series Witness. The Things We Keep is the story of a unique video correspondence over the course of a decade and a broader reflection on the themes of discovery, trust, disillusionment, and what it means to come home. Have a look.
A career reporting to the world.
Where was it, here?
One journalist documents life beyond the headlines. But certain stories can change us.
Filming the craziest story. Well, I mean, we didn't know it was going to be a crazy story, but it turned into one.
A unique journey into what it means to be human. The Things We Keep. A Witness documentary on Al Jazeera.
Joining us now, we have the film's co-directors in Los Angeles, Casey Kaufman, and in Florence, Italy, Alessandro Casigoli. Gentlemen, welcome. Well, this worked out well. Only took you 10 years to put this film together. When did you decide you had a film?
Good question. I think that Alessandro is my friend and the co-director who had the original idea. Some of us have friends who are journalists and stuff like that, and we see the reports on TV. But Alessandro, being a filmmaker, being an artist, has the crazy idea to ask me to send him all of his footage, okay? All of my footage, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the footage, any cameraman or reporter knows that you shoot a lot of footage, not all of it ends up on TV. And Alessandro wanted the stuff that didn't end up on TV. He wanted to see what else was there. I mean, he had that idea, years ago, 7 or 8 years ago. And from that point on, he just started to collect and collect and collect. Femi and Malika, as you know, something that somebody working in the news industry would never have the vision or the time to do.
It's a beast, monster project, Alessandro.
Yeah, I mean, when I asked to see his footage, I had no idea at the beginning to make such a film, but it was something that developed through the years because at that time I was living in Berlin, and I was, we mentioned before the word bubble. I was kind of living in a bubble, just, going out, parties, living the nice life in Berlin. And then suddenly I was watching Casey's footage, like, I could watch 6 hours straight of Casey in Gaza. I was diving into this world, and I could connect, I could relate with those distant words. And I start to think, if I can put this in a film, I think it would be interesting, and that's how it started to develop the idea, and that's how I asked to send him more and more footage.
It's interesting you say that because I think that's exactly what the audience took from it. So this is Suzanne who tweets in, the fact that they kept their friendship going was amazing in itself. Casey's trips to Gaza were both heart-wrenching and joyous, and watching Alessandro with his dad reminded me of moments with my late father, who also had cancer. She goes on to say, I'm envious of Casey's journeys, but I also saw the toll it took on him, and Alessandro, although he didn't travel as much, had a different trauma, and I'm wishing them both well from Ireland. So Casey, talk to us about Gaza, because people who are followers of Al Jazeera English will know your work from there, will know your time spent there. The story that you tell in the documentary ends up having a different ending. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, that was a very nice comment that you just read out. Thanks a lot. I mean, even on my reporting trips, not these larger films, one of my goals in Gaza, like everywhere, was to try to tell very small personal stories, right? And because sometimes those are the stories that people in other places around the world can relate to the most. And I think that's also what motivated Alessandro to dive into the footage more, because he also felt that same feeling where, if I can see, the normal life and the normal, ups and downs of people, whether it's good or bad, you feel a little bit more like them. And that was really the reason and what Alessandro wanted to convey. I mean, the update for who's seen the film, and it's not really a spoiler for who hasn't, but the update of that family in Gaza, I mean, the second kid who was born took the same name as the first kid who passed away, unfortunately. And that kid is now growing and happy and strong. And they've also had a second child, Mohammed. So, like every situation where people live in extreme difficulty and hardship, there is also normal life and things that bring families joy, and their life goes on as well.
Alessandro, in the final minute of this show, time goes so fast, sadly. This is such a deeply personal film. What is it that the general audience of Al Jazeera, do you think, should take away from the film that you made?
But for me, the most important message of this film is to just go out of your house, out of your country, just travel, meet people.
That's beautiful.
You could just realize that people are more similar to you than what you think.
Of course.
And that's how I felt following Casey during these years and doing this film.
Well, thank you for saving up a decade's worth of film. It was worth it. Alessandro, Casey, thank you for being our guest here on the stream. I am going to highly recommend that you do a binge watch of our Al Jazeera documentaries. Come here on my laptop. I will suggest where you can start. Here on Witness, The Things We Keep. You can head across to A Moral Debt, The Legacy of Slavery in the USA, and then finish up with Fault Line's Church of Trump. AlJazeera.com, look at documentaries, and you will find them all there. Enjoy the binge watch. Malika and I will see you online very soon.